to Climate Takes, the Carbon13 podcast, where we ask our guests for their takes on the climate emergency and their industries, and also ask what it's going to take to solve it. In this episode, it's Climate Takes Capital, and we're asking what's being funded, who should be funded, and the trends for the deployment of capital in 2025 to fight the climate emergency. I'm joined by Michael Langguth, co-founding partner of Carbon13, and Dhillon, head of capital at Carbon13.
I guess capital flows to the most exciting opportunities for change, right? Like where we as humanity see a potential to make a big difference and fundamentally change something.
With early stage financing, it's very difficult to kind of see through the woods as to how much capital is going to need to be deployed into these companies to get them to actually hit those impact goals that we would expect, or to actually create a dent as well.
I know in France, for example, it's almost often double what they raise in equity they will get in grant funding. So yeah, that's, I would say, also one of the strengths of the European ecosystem. There is a lot of grant funding available.
Good morning, guys.
Good morning.
Good morning, Sarah.
How are you doing today? You're all good? We've chosen to name this episode Climate Takes Capital, but what do you actually think that means? And where does climate capital go and why?
So I'm happy to kick off. So obviously this term climate tech, climate capital, I think over the last 10, 15, 20 years, we've seen lots of kind of different iterations of it, from the clean tech bubble in the early days to how climate tech has essentially formed into this new powerhouse of an industry where there's capital inflows both at the early stage, but and also at later stages as well. It comes in many different forms, and many different types of companies are getting funded. And Carbon13, I guess, as a venture builder, we kind of position ourselves at the very root of all of this funding. So really looking at these innovations from the grassroots level, before a lot of them have even ideated around the kind of principles that they're going to build as well. So, for me, climate tech is looking really at the earliest stage and that early source of financing.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Like, I guess capital flows to the most exciting opportunities for change, right? Like where we as humanity see a potential to make a big difference and fundamentally change something. And that's where climate tech is just so exciting. But maybe in 2020, 2022, there was a bit of a hype around climate tech. And that hype isn't there as much anymore. But climate tech is also not a one industry kind of change, right? It's a horizontal strategy around every single industry that is out there. Like we've been investing in things around software, making software greener, making hardware, everything from our energy to our materials greener. Like it's very much a horizontal approach to everything that is out there. And it's really just a lens on how to look at strategic opportunities. And that's why I think it's just a very long-term approach.
Right. So you're saying that really it's looking at the different sectors of the economy and applying the climate lens as a horizontal to solve the difficult problems and pain points for business within those sectors.
Yeah, very much. I mean, we do a lot at Carbon13 around helping big corporates decarbonize, and that is in energy. We partner with different investors in the energy space and corporates in the energy space, but it's also things around retail. So, for example, fashion retail, as well as sort of furniture retail, food retail. There's all of these different sectors that have their own emission problems. And you have to remember that emission problems often translate into spending more on your energy than you have to, and also having waste products when you don't have to have them as a waste product, but they could be a valuable resource to be used in a circular business approach. And so a lot of our startups are helping these big corporates decarbonizing their businesses, and that often means also saving money in their cost, or actually being able to make more money with a sort of what it was a waste stream in the past and is now no longer that.
Right. So climate isn't just, it's not just a tick box of compliance. It's what if we can create something using 10% of the energy, which is decoupled from importing oil and gas from somewhere else. It's not, oh, how do we encourage people to make moral choices? It's how do we solve deep, difficult problems which affect the foundations of our economies? How have you got to this? What made you want to come and, Michael, I think starting with you first, what made you want to become a co-founding partner of Carbon13? How did you get here? And why now have you been doing, I think we can say, for half a decade?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a while now in Carbon13, but I think my very first touch point with Climatetech came through actually the social impact angle, where in 2008, 9, I wrote my bachelor thesis on how to teach environmental entrepreneurship to students in my university, which actually then became a course being taught with a slightly different title. But for me, it was always something I knew I wanted to do in the long term, and just seeing the climate crisis get worse and worse made that itch go bigger over time. But I had a e-commerce startup, like a B2B SaaS business in the e-commerce space previously. And actually, that gave me a lot of insights on how to build a business, what it takes to build a good sales team, and so on. We raised a lot of money from different investors, so it really was helpful for me to build my sort of network. But then, yeah, that itch just became bigger and bigger, and I, at some point, just realized I had to leave that business. I was able to sell some of my shares in a secondary, which was a great start to doing investments. So I was able to do some angel investments, and then, yeah, met very luckily the Carbon13 early founding team. So I'm very excited to join that.
That must have been a nice champagne moment as well. and also your journey here, I think, proves another point about investment in climate tech. Many of us have been in this for decades, and the problems are really actually quite well understood. Right? It's actually a case of scaling the solutions, which are, yes, there's technical complexity in that, but a lot of this is a business problem. It's a scalable problem. It's a commercial problem to solve. Investors in climate tech are not new to this. This is not a bandwagon they've jumped on in the last 2 to 4 years, where climate tech suddenly exploded that we saw. And Mint, how about yourself? You're working day to day with a lot of Carbon13's investor community, from angels to VCs and more. What's when you're getting up in the morning and seeing your diary, what makes you go, oh, I'm really looking forward to that? Apart, obviously, from recording a podcast episode.
No, of course. It's an interesting question how you phrased it as well, and it's probably something that we should all give a little bit more thought to. What makes us kind of get up and excited about our jobs? But yeah, I mean, I came into it through working in startups for kind of 10 to 15 years before Carbon13, holding fairly senior positions in kind of working on go-to-market strategies for quite a few different places. And like a lot of people who have either been in the industry for 20 years or become fairly new to the industry at some point, there's always a point of entry. And that point of entry usually comes because there's some association with wanting to have a career that has impact at its focus as well. And I think regardless of the type of work that you're doing at something like Carbon13, whether it's working directly with the ventures, whether you're more kind of operational on how the business is run, or whether someone like me who's speaking a lot to investors, the core kind of, I guess, work and idea of working in those different areas, and what kind of gets me up in the morning is knowing that there is a lot of impact being done through the work that I'm doing, through connecting angels, the value propositioning around what these angels want, and really how to kind of go out to them as well. So yeah, knowing that these companies are funded, I guess, is a good win.
Climate tech attracts people who want to work on some of the hardest problems, and that's very energizing to work with those people. Talking about difficult, complex problems, when we talk about climate tech, I think something that's not sufficiently well understood is we're actually often talking not about software, but about what you would call deep tech, and that can sometimes be a misunderstood term. How would you define? What do we mean by deep tech? Science-led ventures, IP-led ventures. What do we mean by that?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it's quite, I would use some of these interchangeable, and even though I think they have a similar core and then they have slight differentiations. So science-led and deep tech, and maybe what people also say frontier tech. I think what they always mean is that there's a considerable science risk still, right? Like, can you actually do this in this way? Is this possible? Oftentimes that means there's university research or other academic research, there's intellectual property being generated and often also protected through patents. And that kind of research, I think, is just an amazing opportunity for Europe, as we have some really great universities. We're not always that good at sort of commercializing that research. And that's, again, another opportunity for maybe companies like Carbon13 and other VCs that are increasingly looking at that. But yeah, I would say overall it's something that is really considerably new, where you don't know, can this be built? I think in a lot of software businesses, the question, can you build this, isn't really one that people ask anymore, especially nowadays with AI engineers coming up and Meta saying they will have almost no mid-level engineers anymore because everything will be built by an AI. But yeah, so it's that, can it be built?
At its most simple, boiled down to the bare bones, when you're talking about capital, you're funding either how you overcome technical risk or market risk. And I think with deep tech, the question is there's more technical risk, but if you overcome that, the hope usually is that the market demand is strong enough that it will make sense. Could you let's illustrate this specifically? Do we have a couple of specific examples of startups that you would call deep tech?
So there's definitely so there's a couple within the Carbon13 portfolio, and just to touch on what Michael was saying as well, it's such an important point. The idea of these universities spinning out these kind of ideas through a lot of research as well, and I guess coupled with that, there is this big trend that we're now seeing towards a deep tech VCs and proprietary innovation as well. So actually looking at these VCs, big VCs like IQ Capital or Atomico, which are having mandates to look at this kind of technology specifically as well. And it's important. It's an important sector to look at as well. There's a couple of really interesting startups actually, especially in the kind of more AI related space for Carbon13. One which is using robotics, actually Samudra Oceans. So robotics is an interesting space, obviously with AI, because powered robotics and automation is a big key part of AI and its mobilization as well. And they're using seaweed. They're doing seaweed farming, so they're using autonomous robots for kind of real time decision making as well. So that's one company that's leveraging robotics in this AI space as well. There's a couple of others, but maybe Michael, you want to touch on one as well, or?
Yeah, I'm gonna pick a startup from our German programs called Differential Bio. They're still sort of in stealth mode, so the announcement will come soon, maybe in line with this podcast. They are an AI business, or a business that's using AI to create digital twins of processes in the biotech space. So they will help companies, for example, vegan cheese companies, to optimize the way they make experiments so that they can be faster at scaling their operations. So one of the problems in biotech is still that lab work is very manual, right? Like somebody tries out something and you can scale it by having more sort of people in a lab, but that's a very sort of linear way of scaling your operations or your R&D. And AI just, and the ability to create a digital twin of this process and being able to predict and sort of learn ahead, like what could be the iterations of the kind of grow medium to use or the kind of yeast strain to use, can really help these kind of companies to get a lot faster in the way they operate, but also in the way they go to market and scale their businesses, and therefore build valuable businesses in the, for example, vegan cheese space, or like a lot of different spaces, like in the climate tech space, as well as sort of pharma. So yeah, very exciting business, and we're very excited to have them part of our portfolio.
Let's look at the journey of a deep tech startup and the capital needs that startup is going to need. So you're a researcher at a university, and you've produced research, and you think there's something in it here. What are the stages that researcher or the founding team of that IP needs to go through to raise capital to get to the next step? What's that next step? What's the capital? And I'm asking this question because that journey already looks very different to your traditional software VC route, right? Where you build an MVP, get some traction, raise money, get a flywheel going, la, 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 la.
Yeah, sure. So I think some of the points have already been touched on as well. One of the main things is obviously, as you've just rightly said, Sarah, is that a lot of the innovations that are being built in this deep tech space, it's really for us at the stage we are, especially at Carbon13, is to really have a strong founding team to know that what they're going to build is actually possible as well. We know that the climate emergency is going to take these deep technologies in order to actually have some, impact in the space as well. By having a strong founding team at the very beginning is one of the core kind of measures of knowing whether they're going to be able to create this technology or not. And I guess post that is looking at the IP. Is this something that will have what kind of IP is based around this technology, and how can we lean into that as well? A lot of these companies are not going to be market ready for quite some time. Software companies typically might see exits in 3 to 5 years. A deep tech company might see an exit in 10 plus years. So it's really just looking at the gaps we can fill in between the time that it takes to scale to that point of exit. And even at that point of exit, a deep tech company looks very different. A software company, it's not your typical IPO. It's largely going to be an acquisition from a corporate, or at least a partial acquisition, and maybe a licensing play, for example, as well.
So that's quite a fundamental change there.
Yeah, maybe I can just add one thing. I think this is exactly where Carbon13 plays, is this sort of, somebody has an idea in a lab, in a research environment, and then what do we do next? And there's obviously in different countries, for example, in Germany, there's actually quite a lot of support for that very early sort of, it's called the Exist program. You basically get money from through the university to do more research. And then during that time, still, what you're missing often, and that's where Carbon13 can really help, is like what Min said, is this bringing in your commercial co-founders, bringing maybe somebody with industry experience that can help you scale this thing long term. And that's where we come in. But traditionally, I would say the problem fundamentally, the problem is that you need a lab. You need to be able to have access to a lab that is often not even, the difficulty isn't necessarily can you pay for it, because also when we give money to startups, they often, it takes some time to find a lab. So being able to know, okay, in this place I can find a lab, or you can go back to your university where you maybe have done your PhD. So there's a lot of like sort of network building and helping you navigate this ecosystem. And then, yeah, long term, there's obviously debt financing involved. And I would say a lot of our startups get in the UK Innovate UK grants, or in other countries, there's other versions of that. It's about 50% on top, I would say, on top of the equity funding that they raise. In some countries, I know in France, for example, it's almost often double what they raise in equity they will get in grant funding. So yeah, that's, I would say, also one of the strengths of the European ecosystem, that there is a lot of grant funding available that can help you in these early days to sort of de-risk some of the R&D that you have to do.
So let's just summarize this, because this is quite different to software investment. We might expect to see up to half of the startups in the UK and more in France have grant funding for the work that they're doing. We're expecting a much longer time interval until an exit, so 10 plus years. How does that change the mindset of an investor?
What kind of investor are you thinking about?
Well, anything from you're an angel investor and you think that this team is working on something really, really exciting, but then you're like, okay, this is going to be a 10 plus year return. And then when you're venture capital, because deep tech is like 20% of venture capital roughly, how again are you telling that story to your LPs? And how are you having the confidence to lay those bets basically? You're not going to know if you're right for a long time.
I mean, I would disagree that you don't know if you're right for a long time. Like, there's obviously, you can tell, I mean, we can tell quite fast. You can say, okay, which of the startups are doing really well, right? Like we definitely have in our portfolio, I would say 6 to 12 businesses that are doing very well and moving very quickly. And there's a lot of partnership building. There's a lot of sort of building of a movement that is happening with teams very early on. Like if you look at a team like Neom in our portfolio, they're not in the market yet, as in they haven't reached industrial scale yet, but they are building a movement around building people around them that really believe in the business, that have invested in the business, that want to partner with the business. Same with other teams that have been on the podcast already, like Cocoon Carbon, where you can see they're clearly moving faster and moving very quickly towards a really interesting space.
So it's.
Can I add as well? It's not just it's not just the business, right? So it's the sector. These are really, there's this focus on these kind of hard to decarbonize sectors, and if these sectors, as a sector, don't decarbonize, then we're in all sorts of problems. And so these startups, even though there is a long life cycle to getting them towards profitability and all these different hurdles, they're not bigger hurdles, they're just very different hurdles to a software company. The fact that these problems exist, these startups will always have a place, or should always have a place in solving them.
And they're the most significant sectors of the economy, right? Something as fundamental as the making of steel,
Exactly,
or solving the intermittency of solar and wind. It's how the stuff you need to make the car, right? We're not talking about something fringe here. So we're looking at so the metrics that we're looking at is the progression through the technical roadmap. It's the relationship and stakeholder building that we want to see. That's when we start to get excited. Is that a right summation?
I mean, I would say, I mean, obviously in startup land, one of the main proxies, one of the early proxies that we get as an early stage investor is more interest from other investors, right? Like there is in startups, there's a very sort of clear ladder of the size and type of investor that you go through. And we obviously, Min gets a lot of these emails, and me as well, from follow-on investors that say, hey, do you have any interesting startups? Or, hey, I've seen so and such, and then could you make an introduction to us? And I think that, I mean, that goes on for a while, and you can, it's a proxy for success, obviously, because in the end of the day, a startup is there to also be making a change and really create value for their customers. And in the end of the day, that's the long term measure of success. But maybe with these startups that don't have the ability to deliver a product early on, this interest of investors in being sort of seen as a as a change agent in a space, that also means, for example, being invited to conferences to talk and give your viewpoint on a certain industry. So yeah, I think there's a lot of different proxies, but VC interest and VC funding of later stage investors is obviously one where, as an early stage investor, in some cases that might even mean that we would be able to have an exit earlier, right? Like secondaries in 2024 were still a big part of how some VCs got liquidity. And as we are an investor that comes in with our angel investors in the UK, we come in at the very earliest point. We could then make a 20 or 30x return already at a Series A, and therefore have already a very good return for a startup that we've invested only maybe 3 to 5 years in earlier.
Okay. And we've spoken about investors, and we've spoken about, they might be VCs. I think let's move actually to the other side, which is more to the potential customers of these deep tech ventures. Because when we're talking about capital, who better to spend that than a potential customer of a deep tech venture? Could you talk a little bit to how these ventures are working with corporates, and also therefore the role that they're actually playing within ecosystems of investors such as ourselves?
I mean, I'm happy to kick off. So, trying to think of a good example of a portfolio company as well. So, someone like Materials Nexus or MatNex, as they've been rebranded. This is a platform for materials discovery. So it's pretty out there stuff. It was led by a CEO, Dr. Jonathan Bean from Cambridge University, holds a PhD in physics there. And they were one of the first teams that were on the cohort for Carbon13. And this space, obviously, that they're building in, using AI to discover a lot of these materials, it has a whole range of different applications across multiple different industries as well. And so if you take a corporate like, for example, DuPont, who would have these large R&D centers that are very traditional and very slow moving, they are also looking at the types of innovations that, something like MatNex could be building, and how can they speed up their R&D in their processes, like these kind of companies as well. So MatNex really can take a place in these really old, I guess slightly more archaic corporates, and actually innovate and look to build materials in a much quicker and faster and more efficient way as well. Still early days, but they're having quite a lot of good progress as well.
Yeah. It's actually a really interesting example of, again, this sort of interplay between AI and hardware, deep science, and climate tech, where you're using AI to fundamentally change an industry and make something that has been happening. Obviously, R&D for new materials has happened for a long time, but really power charge that. They last year announced one of the first materials to be invented by humanity, a rare earth-free magnet that can be used for example, wind turbines or any kind of where we want to create power out of movement. So it's a very exciting startup with a very exciting mission, and they're combining a lot of these trends, and are then very successful with working very closely with different corporates who then would then be their customers.
Corporates are definitely thinking about this really strategically. For example, you might have the likes of Barclays Eagle Labs, who are a partner of our accelerator, the Venture Launchpad. Applications for that opening soon, actually. And they really want to provide a seed bed for high potential climate tech within the UK. That's part of their mission. But, we work with other partners in different ways. Siemens Energy Ventures, based in Germany, their strategic objective, well, they've got several, but as investors, what they've done is contribute to supporting female founders with bursaries and other support, mentorship, etc., to start filling that pipeline of high potential female founders, because they exist. The women are there. There's just extra challenges to overcome where that kind of input can really help. So these corporates can really influence from the beginning the outcome over the next 5 to 10 years about the kinds of ventures we're seeing and the kinds of people that are building them. At its most basic, it's unusual for a PhD hot off the press from a university to be able to self-fund for years developing something, right? So bursaries can make a difference and pay their sandwiches for the time they need to develop it. And I think when we look at deep science-led ventures, just the width of the ecosystem needed to support these ventures, they just need so much more support, more than the software ventures. At Carbon13, we've got hundreds of domain experts who are experts. They might be an expert in hydrogen or the built environment, and it's about trying to get the founder to speak to the right person at the right time to solve the problem that they need to solve right now. Just the support, the capital needs to fund this huge support network from the very beginning, and it changes the paradigm of the deployment of capital, because it's not just, okay, here, have some money. It's the epitome of smart capital for deep science ventures. And we see that with our angels, right? Is they often want to contribute. They don't just want to give money. They want to contribute to the problems that are being solved, right?
Yeah, and we're very lucky in that respect to have the kind of ecosystem that we have here at Carbon13, where we have these hundreds of, just to touch on what you've said, these hundreds of domain experts that we can really lean into, that have this technical knowledge in every very weird and wonderful specific field as well. So yeah, very, very lucky to be able to rely on those domain experts.
There's also a right, like a lot of angels have gotten into the angel space maybe in the last 10 years, right? A lot of founders that have built software businesses and have been successful in investing in SaaS businesses essentially over the last 10, 15 years. And a lot of them don't have an ecosystem in the academic space, and they don't necessarily have experience in building hardware businesses themselves. So we do see this sort of inertia of angel investors and family offices going from the sort of pure normal software space to investing in climate and in hardware and deep tech. And it's something that we're also trying to help change. So if anybody is out there and keen to engage more with climate tech ventures, we're always open to bringing you into the cohort. In Germany, or more specifically in Hamburg, we've organized or co-founded a thing called the Deep Tech Club, which is the other co-founding partners are Hamburg City Innovations, as well as a few of the local angels and family offices. And it's about sort of knowledge sharing. It's about bringing in or sort of sharing some of that knowledge around how do you actually judge a early stage deep tech startup? Like, how can you tell this will be successful? Or how do you help those startups long term? Like, what's the best value add that you can offer them? I think there's just a lot of learning that the VC industry as a whole is doing still in some of the sort of scaling up of these deep tech ventures. And that's where corporates who have been doing this for a long time, like Siemens Energy Ventures has been building energy plants for a long time. And there can be this great sort of interplay between corporate VC as well as sort of corporate R&D teams, as well as academics, as well as VC and angels. So yeah, I think it's a very exciting space for that reason.
Where do we see that VC industry going in 2025?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would look back just briefly, because
Sure.
what was interesting in 2024 is that you obviously had a huge surge of AI. Like most deals that were made and most of the growth rounds were really focused around AI, especially in the US. But you had an overall decrease of VC funding globally, which is interesting. And a lot of it was driven by a decrease of investment sort of in China and then also in the US. I think in the UK, there was also an overall decrease, but climate tech actually had a surge. So 24% more investments in climate tech. And in AI and climate tech was actually 128% increase. At the same time, in Europe, you had sort of the climate tech industry still had the top spot of investments, while overall there was a decline again. So I think in 2025, there's probably AI will still be a very big topic, right? We will see a lot of the teams. And really, I think for me, the interesting thing about AI is that it feels a little bit similar from a conversation like mobile. Like when I built my last startup in 2010, everything was mobile, right? Like everybody was building mobile apps. Everything you had to do was mobile. And it's not like mobile has gone away, right? Like most of us look at our phone thousands or at least hundreds of times a day. We spend hours of our day on our mobile phones. So mobile itself hasn't gone away, but it isn't as much of a topic for investment anymore. And I think over time, we'll see something similar with AI. Like it's now a big topic of investment, but over time, it will just be a fundamental layer of everything that we do. So our startups, we do tell them a lot that they have to look at how do they use AI and how do they build with AI. So yeah, 2025 definitely still a year of AI, but hopefully also we see some up rounds from some of the startups we've built, and climate tech generally being strong as it was at least in Europe last year.
Mm. And I guess just to add to that as well, I guess we've talked a lot about deep tech and AI applications and growth in capital in deep tech as well, and the importance of it in the space. But that's not to say that it doesn't have its place in software as well. AI is very much transforming software and software defensibility as well, especially within that kind of product life cycle management space. So there's always these kind of continuous improvement loops, which are powered now by AI. So you get this almost real-time optimization and feedback, something which was never be able to done before. So having this shift to these kind of self-improving platforms is really just enhancing the defensibility of the overall space. And again, there's companies within our portfolio that are looking at that as well. So just have a look at something like Preoptima, which is using AI-driven product lifecycle management as well to kind of evaluate the whole carbon impact of its design of buildings. So yeah.
Yeah. I'm very excited for one of the next episodes where we're talking to Infios who are doing that's supply chain. Is exactly what you've said. Supply chain for battery materials, and particularly energy storage
Exactly.
batteries. And from a climate challenge point of view, so my final question, from a climate point of view, where should more capital go? And for context, the bulk of investment into climate technologies is probably still energy and transport.
Yeah, I think energy was one of the biggest spaces in 2024, and it will likely be in 2025. There's just so much to be done in what also, yeah, Sarah, you said earlier about actually scaling and sort of financing and rolling out the technologies that we need. Like we all need, like we know that the right thing for everyone with a house is to have solar on the roof, to have a battery charger connected to a wall plug for your electric car and a heat pump, right? Like there's this sort of, we know that that's the right model because it will save you money long term. Probably you'll do some kind of insulation in your house as well, but like there's that bit which will make you money in the long term and will make you save money. Like I recently spoke to a taxi driver who has a wall plug and that whole setup in his house, and he said for his taxi, and he's got eight taxis. He's saving £2,000 a month on the taxi that is charged through the system, both at work and at home. And it's very exciting, right? Like the kind of opportunities that you get from that. So rolling that out and doing more also in industry around electricity and energy will still be a big topic. I think overall there's something like I strongly believe that we can do and that we will work on. I think there's a lot of potential in agriculture. It's a very difficult space to decarbonize. But yeah, I think B2B opportunities are wide and large in climate, and founders should look around and try to engage with corporates in their sustainability goals and see how they can actually help to make them go faster on that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for me, so some of the areas that we've touched on is looking at certain technologies and why, and the difficulty in actually having them funded because they are complex technologies. So I think it's taking these complex technologies in really heavy, hard to abate sectors. So taking something like heavy industry, like cement, steel, chemicals, all of these industries that have a massive carbon footprint, but with early stage financing, it's very difficult to kind of see through the woods as to how much capital is going to need to be deployed into these companies to get them to actually hit those impact goals that we would expect, or to actually create a dent as well. So those hard to abate sectors, I would say. And again, have a look at some of our portfolio companies working in this space, like Cocoon Carbon, who are kind of looking at green cement and ways to make the production of these different materials within the built environment a real thing. So,
Amazing. Thank you, guys. For anyone listening to this, I strongly encourage you, if you've been interested by any of these topics, you're very welcome to reach out to us to talk about supporting the ventures, working with the ventures, or building your own venture. You're very welcome to talk to us. We're an open community. We're very friendly. And we want to help the whole ecosystem. And I think when we look at what we've discussed today, I think we can say that climate takes deep science-led ventures. Climate takes patience and a longer rate of return to the exits and a more complex capital stack to fund it. Climate takes a much bigger ecosystem to support each venture, from investors through to experts, through to corporates, through to research bodies such as universities. And climate takes capital to solve these challenges that humanity is facing. Thank you very much for listening. See you next time.
Thank you very much, Sarah.